Hello, and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown. So on today's show, we've got Mike Jones, our local cider expert, talking us through some of the points about how to make good cider. Hopefully, we'll all learn something about this, the processes and what's involved. So I first met Mike at one of our apple days, and he clearly very much into his apples and into growing different types of apples. In our next podcast, Mike talks us through a lot more about the apples and how to grow them, how to graft them, how to do everything with apples, basically. But in this week's show, we're talking about what he really enjoys growing his apples for, which is cider making. So, Mike, a few years ago, I had the great pleasure of coming and watching you pressing and chopping up apples, turning them into juice, which you're then processing into cider. But I guess the first question would be, what is cider?
Well, cider, in the UK anyway, is just fermented apple juice that nearly all the sugar in it is turned into alcohol.
Okay. There's a few different sort of ways of spelling cider, isn't there? And a few different ideas as to what cider is, whether it's got alcohol in it or not.
Well, yeah, that's just a marketing gimmick, isn't it, really? I stick to one simple English way of spelling the word and leave the marketing to other people.
So the English definition is obviously that cider has got alcohol in it and it's apple juice that's been fermented, whereas our friends over in America, cider is what we class as apple juice, and then they have hard cider, from my understanding.
Yes, it does confuse a lot of people. It even confuses English environmental health officers who try to apply apple juice standards to cider.
When it's alcohol.
So there's the dangers of going online, isn't it, and using words without knowing the background. So.
Excellent. And if you're going to make cider, how would you go about it?
Well, first of all, do you want me to give you the full details, or shall we start? Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, you've got to quite critically choose your apples.
Yep.
The mix is critical to the result that you're going to get.
Okay.
So shall we spend some time on that first, or just assume we've got the mix and then go through the process? Because there's quite a lot in choosing.
Well, why don't you give us a couple of varieties and sort of a basic. I mean, obviously, like you say, there's hundreds of different varieties of cider apples and even more probably of regular apples. But if you were going to set out with the idea of maybe in 10 years' time I'm going to have some apple trees in my orchard that I can grow some cider from, what sort of mixture of apples would you look to grow?
Okay, based on my experience over the last 10, 15 years, then a mix of what are called cider apples together with what we call orchard apples, ones that are grown for eating and cooking, will give you the most balanced mix, the most balanced cider in the end. That's my simple conclusion. It's a very subjective thing what a good cider is. We've run cider courses for 10 years.
Okay.
And one of the highlights of our cider courses has been to taste lots of single variety ciders and compare them to the sort of mixes that we end up with. Often I will give an example of something. Everybody will have a little sample of one particular cider, and I will say, this one is okay, but is maybe a little monoflavour. And other people will say, but I think that's fantastic.
Yep.
So you've got to be very humble and careful when you try to tell people that this is a good one and that one is not so good.
There's some basics. Something like a Dabinett or a Bull's Black. I mean, would they make?
Well, Dabinett is a very good starting point. If there's one tree that you should start with, it would be Dabinett.
Okay.
It's doesn't make a perfect cider on its own, because it just needs a little bit more acid in it. So put a little bit of cooking, maybe 20% of any sort of sharp cooking apple with it.
Yep.
depending on your tastes, and you will probably get an instant drink.
Yep.
There are lots of ones with more bitterness, astringency, all sorts of things that make multi-flavour. Perhaps what I like most is ones where you take a swig and move it round your mouth and you pick up different flavours. Now, to me, that's a really good cider. I'm not saying that's the only one you want to drink. It's one wants to really have different ciders, and
yep.
We have 30 different ciders in our house at any one time that we can decide each day. I will see what's there and pick a different bottle according to my mood. So yeah, you've got to experiment, find what you like. I think one thing that's really worth emphasising is the apples that most people have easy access to. They think, oh, I've got a tree here, huge surplus of apples, let's turn them into cider. Maybe if they're hard green, it isn't going to turn out too well. It's going to be very sharp. And in fact, most mixers, even with good eating apples, unless they're really, really ripe, the general turnout will be it's a bit on the sharp side. Okay. That was true for us for the first few years.
And when you say it's sharp, is that going to be like a dry flavour?
A bit acid, really.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Dry is not a term I'd use. Dry would be more associated with a bit of tannin, I think.
Okay.
So it's that where you. Then what happens is, to try and compensate for that, you end up feeling you need a bit of sugar in there. But sugar is, it's getting back to a bit like apple juice. You think apple juice is naturally about nearly 15% sugar.
Really?
You really ought to ease off on it. When we do apple days and children are sampling, you've got to really hold them back because they start swigging this stuff, and their parents are going to be very unhappy later in the day when they've drunk the equivalent of 10 apples or something. So there's a lot of acidity in those eating apples. It doesn't come over because the sugar is compensating it. In the cider, you take that sugar out and it tastes completely different, but much sharper. So the beauty of cider apples, or certainly the sweets and the bittersweets, is that they have very low acidity. Therefore, you can end up with something that isn't going to end up too acid, and you can balance it with a bit more with sharps, with cooking apples to bring it up. It's the balance that's the right.
How to get the good flavour in a cider. Excellent. Okay, and you mentioned cider courses. You've been doing those for a while now, haven't you?
Well, yes, we started after having initially 15 years or so ago bought a small press and a mill to make apple juice, and then thought, well, there's something better we can make than that. From our woodland contacts, we'd been members of the Small Woods Association for many years, an excellent organisation, and runs lots of courses on all sorts of things. And at that time, they were running a cider course up in Ironbridge, very nice place to go for a cider. So we went off for a day's cider course. We were very lucky that the guy running it, called Mike Pooley, who's written a book on the subject, and his course was very much aimed at community activities. It was his whole emphasis as a community activity, getting people together to use cider making, apple pressing for that. And we were inspired. It was a fantastic day, and his message at the end was go away and spread the message. And so after a year or so, we had the confidence to start an apple day in our village, which allowed anybody who brought their apples along to use our kit to press them, and either for drinking or making cider. And after a year or two of even greater confidence, we decided we'd run the cider course ourselves. Yeah. We did this in conjunction with the Milton Keynes Parks Trust, so they handled all the provided the site and the advertising and things, they were absolutely overrun with applicants. People were getting annoyed because in January the course was full because it was too cheap, basically. I think that was the problem. So we had some really good sessions teaching people what we knew and sampling it. We developed the course very much based on what we'd done, but then expanded it into this idea of making single variety ciders so people could see that if they just use that one apple, this is what they get. And some were nice, some were totally undrinkable. But there's no quicker way of learning than to see what the result is. So yes, cider courses, unfortunately COVID put a stop to that, so didn't do one last year and we're not doing one this year. We then moved on to doing them in conjunction with the Mid-Shires Orchard Group, who do, as you know, a lot of good things in the apple world.
Yep.
And running those in our village hall. So those were always excellent days, and people went away very happy with their gallon of apple juice to ferment. And
excellent. So, yeah, just thinking, we talked briefly about the varieties of apples that we're going to potentially grow. So once you've got your crop of apples that have all fallen on the ground because they're nice and ripe, presumably pick them up, and how do we then turn them into something that's suitable for putting in the press or the scratter? And
yeah, the way we work is we have a load of buckets. We fill the buckets with varieties that I make a note of. So my lawn ends up with maybe 20 or 30 buckets full of apples in groups. And I look down them with my experience and say, right, we'll have 5 of those and 3 of those and 2 of those. Of course, apples age in different rates. Some will keep a bit longer. So some you've got to use before they go too bad. They get a little bit bruised. The small bruises don't really matter. If it's starting to go rotten, then we've got to get that bit out. Got the mix of apples. I personally think it's better to do the mix beforehand rather than, you could say, make all the individual ciders and mix them. It does work, but it's something in the fermentation that's better, I think, if you've got the mix right.
Yeah.
We wash our apples. We do use a sodium metabisulfite solution.
Right.
After we've done it, we do a double clean. We cut out any bits that are bad, any rot. Don't worry too much about grubs and them. That all adds to the flavour, a little bit of extra flavour if you've got a few of those in there.
Fair enough.
Then we mill. With mills, there's a whole subject of mills. You could start with just a bucket and a tree trunk and squash them. That's the way we like to demonstrate to people who just want to make a gallon. And then you go through the whole lot of Pulp Master, which is a bucket with a blade you put your electric drill to turn. Absolutely lethal. We'll never use it in a demonstration, but sort of works. And it's cheap. That's the thing. If you want to do a demo, you don't know whether you want to spend the money. £25 or so is called a Pulp Master. Is
that from Vigo?
They don't. It's not that they're made by them, I don't think. But it may well supply it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's
essentially
widely available
just like
online.
A sort of big fat blade on a
it's just a flat stainless steel blade on a drill and up and down. The problem with that one is that you have to. You do 5 seconds of up and down, and then got to remix the apples because it hasn't done half of them. So anyway, you can do it very cheaply. Then you've got the grinders, but once you tried an electric mill, you never go back. The problem is the price. So that's where people benefit. Want to do a few, come along to the apple day, they can bring their apples, grind them all and mill them all and take them away. So knowing somebody with one is the answer if you don't do enough to justify buying one yourself. So we've milled our apples.
Yep.
We press. I still use a very small press for doing single variety. I make just a 5 litre sample demijohn. lovely little things like the little Ferrari aluminium frame, stainless containers, beautiful little press. Great for 2 presses will do a gallon with that. We've sort of settled on a maximum 5 gallon a press cloth rack and cheese, cloth and cheese, what do they call them? Forget the name now. Anyway, you have a cloth and you have a board, and you stack them up, and the juice flows out, and that there are more efficient things. You get onto the bigger ones with the water powered to squash out if you really want to get volume. But our volumes don't require. We sort of now settled into 60 gallons a year.
Yeah, because your press is quite a bit more advanced than my mother's one, which is just a round bucket with a
They're the most
screw.
common. Indeed, and it's more efficient because those are fine, but what you're doing is squashing the stuff together, and so the bit in the middle, the juice can't get out.
Yep.
So you get less juice.
Whereas with the cheese
if you've got lots of thin layers and boards in between where the juice can run out, then you get a bit more. And then these, I think they're called hydropressors, which are even more efficient.
Well, they're hydraulic rams, aren't they? With,
effectively water-driven. Yeah,
them press the things.
Yes, we haven't needed to go up to that because for our requirement. When we first started, it was more hit and miss, so we perhaps made 150 gallons and threw away half of it. Because it's not that you throw it away; it's that you always drink the best.
Yes,
with cider, you find that's a nice one, so you work through it. The ones that are not so good sit there, and then the next year comes round and you need the bottles, so it has to be thrown away very often.
Well, the other option, what I found to do with some of the mixtures I've made, is turn it into apple cider vinegar, which is a very easy process. You can chuck some cider vinegar mother in there and leave it with the top off, and off it goes and turns into vinegar. Yeah,
you don't even need to. I mean, it's in the air, isn't it? What I do, we don't make an awful lot because we don't use that many gallons of vinegar.
No, it's then what do you do with the vinegar?
Some people drink it, don't they? But personally, we just put it on chips and things, and
that's it. It does taste quite nice, though.
Yeah, but it does just. I just half fill a demijohn with cider. Yep. And actually, a little tip there is if you get some of the naturally sweeter cider, it tastes really good with the vinegary taste. And I just put a bit of gauze over the top and leave it in the shed for 3 months, and that's it, and out it comes.
Excellent. Sorry, we're digressing again.
We didn't finish where we were going down the pressing, the cider making. So we got as far as we've pressed it.
Yep.
And then when you've pressed it, we tended to move away from the recommended routines. Most people say the first thing to do is to sulfite it to kill all the yeasts and then add yeast. We've really didn't see any point in sulfiting it because if you put yeast in it, it's dominant anyway. It takes over. If you're a purist, we're sort of not quite purists in the way that we do use yeast. Purists would really hate the idea of putting yeast in. But we did a lot of trials in the early days where we did the same apple mix with just letting the natural yeast work and adding yeasts. And the only difference was that the ones with yeast seemed to move at a much faster pace. We couldn't detect the difference in flavour, although purists will tell you there is.
Yeah, because the apples are naturally, the skins generally are coated in sort of, like you say, natural airborne yeasts.
They say, or is it in the air? Who knows where it is? It's around, I think. So.
But normally when we're making cider, we're putting it in a bucket with a lid on it and a airlock, aren't we? So potentially, if there's some in the void in the airspace above the liquid, that might be.
Who knows where it comes from? Yes, I mean this issue of air. Air is not a problem during the vigorous stage.
Yeah.
Because what happens is you get this, when you've never done it before, you get this frightful froth, this gunge brown stuff. And if you're using cider apples, it's obviously thicker, or comes up really thick and brown, and
so
spills over.
Beer brewers might know that as a krausen.
Right.
That's the name for that in beer brewing. It's just effectively just a massive explosion of yeast and froth that is created from.
Yeah. So while it looks frightening, it's actually a good sign.
Yeah, it means you've got a live fermentation and you don't have to worry.
Yeah, well, you have to worry about your kitchen floor. Really.
Yeah,
it's very unpopular when it stains and the floor. But so that lasts a few days, and then it settles. Once it settles down, then you can take your eyes off it. But then it becomes important to keep it under airlock. Because while it's vigorous, there's enough carbon dioxide coming off to push the air out the way, but as it slows down, it gets more and more important. Air, as we've implied with the cider vinegar, the air will turn it into vinegar if you have too much in there. So yes, it is important to always keep the air out. Talking to people who've had failures, you go through trying to work out why, and you find that they only had enough apple juice to fill half the container. We know why you got vinegar then. Didn't occur to them.
And with regards to the yeast, does you talk about adding your own yeast? Is there any sort of specific ones?
Well, I experimented. I bought all, worked through them and see.
So champagne yeast is a...
Yeah, champagne yeast seem to be recommended.
Right.
I actually just buy the Young's cider yeast. It's fairly cheap.
Yep.
They say one little sachet does 5 gallons, 30 litres. I make it do 5 times that. It seems to work just as well. It gets it going. So,
and you're not using a starter for that. You just literally sprinkle yeast straight onto
That's it. Yeah, I put it straight in.
Cool.
And then, depending on the apples, some will raw through in maybe 2 weeks.
Right. Others
more slowly, maybe 6 weeks, and some even get stuck. And for those who like it sweet, then maybe that's what you want. If it naturally stops and won't, sometimes you can add more yeast and a bit of nutrients. Sometimes they just don't want to go. Well, to me, that's a throwaway job because I don't like my cider sweet. But to somebody who does, that might be a benefit, because even if it's too sweet, you could always dilute some of the dry stuff with it and mix it up and get it. Although it might restart then.
Yep.
You've got to watch that.
Because that's something that maybe people would be interested to know, is that obviously in commercial cider making, it's a totally different process to what we're talking about.
It is. Isn't it? It is, yeah. I'd recommend the tours. I've been round the Westerns tour and the Thatcher's tour.
Yeah,
they're well worth the money, and they're very straight. They show you an awful lot. I mean, you get very close to the lines, and you've got to give it to them. They are using real apples, the same sort of quality apples. It's those sorts of what I call proper cider makers are growing their own and using local farmers. They're not importing Chinese concentrate,
right?
But they are making concentrate, and it's really the logistics problem they have, that they can't do like us, go once a year make cider. They have to make cider continually as the market demands it.
Yep.
So those apples you see going in the lorries within a day, those are a thick syrup. They've been and the big stainless steel cylinders you see are full of syrup, that's apple syrup, juice syrup, that's as thick as honey.
Wow.
So that is just brought out when they need to make cider and mixed with water. They use a special yeast that will go to high alcohol levels, 15% or so. So they ferment it right out with added sugar to do that.
So they're boosting the alcohol levels.
Boost it, and then they dilute back to what their final requirement is. And I think one of the differences between the cider we make traditionally and what they make is that I think ours is always a lot more appler, simply because it's got more apples in it. They've diluted theirs back down to get. I suppose it's an easy way of getting the right alcohol level that they have to be.
Yeah. They're aiming for 8% or something like that.
Yeah. They've got to have it right. And the filtering, they then very high tech filtering. I know at Weston's they did 11 stages of filtering on the cider to get it clear, because at that point it's really cloudy, and people generally want, unless it's sold as cloudy cider, want clear cider. And then it's flat, so they're going to have to add carbon dioxide. That goes in milliseconds before the bottle is sealed. Little jabbers, you can watch them doing it. It's quite amazing. They add sugar because most people like their cider sweet, and it's pasteurised.
So presumably they pasteurise it first to kill all the yeast and then add the sugar after, so it doesn't... can't
remember that detail. But it's obviously important that it's... it depends whether... that would be tough if you added the sugar and then it actually had a bit of yeast on the sugar, wouldn't it? So, I've probably missed out 10 stages in there, but you can see it's
totally different from
it's
what
totally
the
different. It's not the same. It's amazing how it's drinkable at all, really.
Because there's another product called white cider, isn't there? That's
enlighten me.
White cider is after they've processed all the apples and taken all the juice out of them, you then wash them all with water and reprocess those apples again and get a secondary sort of extraction out of the apples, and then ferment that. And
somewhat thinner, is it?
Yeah, it's a fairly interesting product if you like that sort of thing, but no, it's not. It's even less real than the likes of sort of commercial ciders are. But yeah, it's just...
I've not come across that. Are you selling that in your...
No, we don't sell any white cider. But then the other thing is obviously all the apples then get processed into animal food, don't they? And are sent off to feed the pigs. And
I'm sure nothing's wasted in their case. Yeah, yes, ours goes on the compost really, and there are a few sheep at the back of our house that benefit a little bit as well.
That's it.
They do love it.
So once we've gone through the primary fermentation, as in once you've got that big frothy mess in your container, and then the airlock has calmed down a little bit, and you're sort of bubbling at one bubble every 30 seconds to say 3 minutes.
Yeah. Best to have a hydrometer really, and very cheap. $5 will get you something. Learn how to use it. It's very simple. And then you know what's happening. If it stops at halfway, you ought to know that. Well, you probably tell by tasting it, but...
Because a hydrometer measures the sort of thickness of the liquid, doesn't it?
Effectively. And the only thickness is the sugar of any significance. So it's really telling you the amount of sugar. Yeah. So that's really, I would always use a hydrometer. Once it gets below 1.005, that's down at 10% of its typical starting, then you're more or less, if you want it a bit sweet, you could, even though it might be still bubbling a little bit, you could bottle some then.
Right.
Below that, you're fairly safe even in glass. Perhaps might go slightly lower, maybe 0.003.
Yep.
Many ciders go straight out to 1.000. Of course, that doesn't mean there's no sugar, because if you've got, say, 5-6% alcohol, which has got a lower density than water, then there must be a bit of sugar there to
make it
push it to naught. Yeah, so maybe about 1% sugar, something like that. That's where ciders should be,
right?
In my opinion. And so we've moved much more to bottling sooner than later.
Okay.
If you can leave it, well, we missed out one stage, which is racking off.
Yep.
Once it's stopped, you've got a sediment on the bottom. You don't want to leave it on that sediment for a long time. A few weeks would be all right, but not months, definitely not. Otherwise, you'll get off flavours.
Okay.
Getting back in. So it needs siphoning off. We call it racking off.
Yep.
Siphon off, and then you short of a little bit, so you top it up with water because you don't want any air, and you leave it under airlock. So it'll stay there happily for a while. It settles perhaps a bit, so if it's cloudy, sometimes they'll clear a little bit more.
Because you can rack more than once, can't you?
You can rack, and some of if you've got a lot of the thicker cider apples, bitter ones, they often have a lot more. They go on dropping sediment for longer. So those ones you often have to maybe rack twice or 3 times. It depends whether you mind a bit of sediment in your bottles.
Yep.
I tend to rack off less often now, maybe once or twice at the most, mostly only once.
Okay.
If you get it in the bottles sooner, then you're sealing it off. If there's a little bit of activity going on, you're getting a bit of natural carbon dioxide in your bottle.
Yep.
Gives it a spritz.
Because the yeast is still working, but very slowly, so it'll presumably...
And it seems to me that I suppose it's making it more acid because it's carbon dioxide dissolving. It's forced into solution. Yep. It seems to slow down any further action.
Right.
And I've not had bottles exploding recently since I think when I actually bottled some at 008 and 1.008, then that was just a little pushing luck, especially on a warm summer's evening. You get things on higher shelves sort of hitting the ceiling. Not terribly popular in the house, really.
Yeah.
But I haven't had that happen bottling at 003. So unless you in a really... I did have somebody buy some cider off me once and left it on the back of their car on a summer's day, and not a good idea. That did cause it to break, but kept in the normal conditions, you're going to be all right. So you get that little bit of carbonation. We call it spritz.
Yep. Lifts
the cider, makes it. It's nice to see the little bubbles rising when you're drinking it.
Yep.
And again, even though I did used to think, oh, I've got to wait till it clears before I bottle it. But often, in some cases, it would take so long, it was losing quality. If you accept that you're going to get a little bit more sediment in your bottle, so you may have to throw away the bottom centimetre if you're not a sediment drinker, then you can, it will clear. So most of my ciders are completely clear after 6 months.
Right.
If you shake the bottle, then it'll go cloudy, but it'll settle out again in 10 minutes or something. So that fixes the cider.
Yep.
If you leave it under airlock, it's gradually it's very, very slowly losing the last little bit of sugar. And you end up, if you lift it right through till April, May, it becomes really bluntly dry.
Right.
So we take great care to not do that.
Yep. So are you bottling sort of generally, you'll obviously take the crop off this time of year and then maybe bottle around Christmas?
Yeah, I start bottling towards the end of the year, maybe a little early with some of the first ones.
Yeah. But then, like you say, that if you've got a hydrometer, you can check the alcohol content and the sort of sugar content at that point and make sure that you're not putting it in
that
too
it's
early,
going to be safe.
And then that way you can make sure you're not popping bottles. Excellent. Okay. Have you got any tips that you'd give potential cider makers?
Well, don't bother with those apples that are dropping early. It's so tempting to think, oh, they're all coming off. I better get started. And I used to faithfully get them all swept up and start in early September doing it. And then that was the cider made cider, but that was the cider that always sat to the end and never got drunk because there was always something better. And so, yeah, ignore those. Somehow leave those ones for the birds.
Okay.
It's very much later the better. You've got to be... I nearly got caught out one year when the season was very early. And so you have to sort of... You can't go on fixed dates necessarily.
Okay.
It's for many years, it was... I didn't start collecting apples till the middle of October. But then there was a year when they were all down by then, so I nearly missed out. So you've got to really judge on with a cider apple tree. Then when half have fallen, you shake the rest off. They should come off. So then you know they're ripe, and then you better not ignore those, or you won't get any.
So you talk about shaking them off, and I've seen videos of tractors with special apparatus that literally shake the tree a bit like you would with an olive tree to get the olives out. Yeah. Presumably, with your trees, is it just a case of getting the hard hat on and going up and sort of shaking the branches, or?
Well, mine are mostly at a size where I can do it from the ground.
Okay.
But yes, it will become more of a problem. Maybe I'll have to invest in one of these bits of kit.
They do look quite fun. It always amuses me, astounds me more, that it doesn't damage the tree when you see them being sort of jutted around so violently.
Perhaps it helps make it fruit next year.
Well, yeah, and if it breaks the roots up a little bit, I guess it makes them grow new roots and find new sources of nutrients and keeps them going better.
It does look a bit severe, doesn't it?
Definitely. Excellent. And so, Mike, very roughly, how many, you talked about sort of 3 buckets of this, 2 buckets of that. How many...
It's a bucket.
How many kilos of apples...
in a bucket, I would think about 6-7 kilograms, depends how big the bucket is, of course.
Okay, so if we've got, say, 10 kilos of apples, how much cider do you think you're going to get out of that?
10 kilos will give you a gallon or 5 litres, I suppose.
Okay, and that's sort of is that one demijohn? Or?
Yep, that's near enough a demijohn
in old terms.
In old terms, yeah, near enough.
Excellent. Cider apples, how do they vary? We talked about different blends of apples. I mean,
right. Well, we have a division of 4 is conventionally used, where you have apples that have tannin in. That's sort of bitterness, can be astringent that makes your cheeks come out, is astringency.
Yep.
You go like that, as opposed to hard, which is more on the front of your mouth, more of I call a blunt sort of taste.
Right.
Sounds highly undesirable, but does add something in the right amounts in cider. So bitterness caused by tannins is a characteristic of some cider apples, those that are called either Bittersharps or Bittersweets. Those apples are only grown for cider because nobody wants to eat bitter apples. But also apples, cooking and eating apples, are also used in cider making, and the best cider is normally a mix of all these. Traditionally, or historically, the eastern counties of England made their ciders from reject eating and cooking apples, ones that were blemished is the word I'm after.
Yep.
They didn't have any bitterness in them. So think of Aspel's cider, although if you look at Aspel's now, they do seem to have planted quite a lot of true cider apple bitter ones as well, so maybe it's got a bit more complex from originally. West Country is known for its bitter ciders, bitterness in the ciders, quite a different product. Everybody who starts making cider generally hasn't got access to bitter apples, so they end up making ciders which more like the east of England's, eastern counties. Often they are a bit on the sharp side.
Right.
I did actually taste earlier in the year, someone up in Warwickshire was making what was actually a very nice cider out of just 3 eating apples: Spartan, Egremont, Russet, and Cox. And I was quite surprised. It was very drinkable.
And was that a sweet cider or a dry?
No, because in fact I was sampled 2. One where they added sugar, which I had to instantly reject on my taste buds. I couldn't judge it because if it's got added sugar, it's like putting saccharin in.
Yep.
Even if it's sugar, I can't take it. It ruins the whole product for me. So I said, sorry, I can't comment on that. It's sweet. But this one was measured pretty low, and yet it was a good balance. So I was impressed. And I think the key there is that they must have been using very ripe apples.
Right.
I have found when I've had a glut of some of the really full-flavoured ones, like Coxy type apples. Well, I tend to use things like Holstein and Chivers Delight and Winter Gem, things like that. Really good flavours. Those can make almost. It needs a bit of something, but you think it's almost there as a standalone cider.
Okay. What would you go and get for your 5 varieties of apples?
Right. Okay. So if you're buying, Dabinett definitely. Things like Chesil Jersey, Tremlet bitter. These are bittersweets. Camelot is one that gives me no end of apples. I mean, one characteristic you want is a lot of apples reliably. It's all very well. Things like Kingston Black, which can make a very nice cider, but in many years it's a bit shy. Yep. So I've got quite a lot of Kingston Black trees, but I never end up making more than a couple of gallons. While other trees would give me, well, for example, this Camelot tree, I think I got about the equivalent of 60 litres off it. It's just a one tree.
100 kilos of apples.
Yeah, a lot. So there's various things you've got to consider when you're putting trees in. Yeah. If you like, Tom Putt's a very useful apple. It's a little bit on the sharp side, maybe, but some people, a very clean tasting cider. And it's a tree which does fruit quite heavily most years, so that's a good one if you want don't mind a slightly sharper one.
So the varieties we've gone through so far are what I know as classic or sort of heritage varieties.
Heritage, that's the word, yes. Heritage.
There's a place, I don't think it's going anymore, the Long Ashton Research Centre.
Long Ashton Research, yeah, that was criminal, the government closing that. It had done so much good work. Perhaps they'd done too much good work, and I think that closed about 2000.
Okay, and they were devoted to cider. Was it just cider?
Developing, they developed cider making techniques. They trialled many apples to find which ones were suitable for cider making, given all the requirements, especially commercial people have, that they need to extend the season, they want reliable cropping, good flavour, all those sorts of characteristics. So they were developing, set out, I don't know how much, probably they were doing the breeding, I'm not sure the details, but certainly they were trialling many apples and then recommending them for use. One of the things was that an extension of the season, if they could get cider apples a month earlier, then the presses could be used earlier and the peak load would be reduced. So some of the apples, in fact, some of the apples which we're at in Milton Keynes, where there's a hidden cider apple orchard, would be from that generation, the ones they developed, things like Ashton Bitter, Bull's Bittersweet, Ellis Bitter. I think they came out of that work. Yep. Very, very, what should we say, thick. How can we describe? They give a sherry-like mix. You really, come on, offer me a word.
Strong
or well, almost sickly.
Okay.
Almost like you think of a heavy sherry or something like that, but in juice terms. Apples that on their own would, trying to think which one, well, Yarlington Mill. Yep. Yarlington Mill. I don't think that's one they bred, but it's got the same characteristics, a very, very, very strong, heavy flavour. Yep. I find it too much. It's well, sickly
as a single variety, I suppose it would be, but then I guess if you're mixing it with...
Yeah, it's for mixing, so you can bring it down with the... If you've got an excess of sharps and too many cooking apples, or then you can use that to counter the acidity of the other apples, and the acidic acid apples bring that to something of a more balanced. Yeah, so the Yarlington Mill and Harry Master's Jersey, that's a very interesting one. I use that. I think that deceives the taste buds.
Okay.
If not everybody's on board, but I'm an anti-sugar man in drinks anyway.
Yep.
The best way to ruin a drink is to put sugar in it or not take it out. And we all know how unhealthy sugar is, diabetes, and it's terrible stuff. So if you like sugar in things, it's time to sort of try and get it out. Once you get it out, retrain your taste buds, then you can taste the real apple quality. Now, to help you in doing that, if you're making cider, don't make it too sharp, because if you make it too sharp, you'll inevitably want to put sugar in to counter that. Right. But also, things like Harry Master Jersey has a sort of flavour that tends to make you think it's got a bit of sweetness in it. It's an effective flavour without it actually adding sweetness.
Okay.
So too much of it, it's sickly, but 10% maybe can help. So that's an interesting one. Going back to commercial apples, Long Ashton also in the 1980s developed a whole range of apples that they gave girls' names to.
Okay.
I think many staff were immortalised by having an
Brilliant.
apple named after them. I think there's an excellent book written by Liz Coppas. If you want to know about cider apples, one called Cider Apples and New Pomona. She worked there, and I think Lizzie must have been named after her.
Okay.
There's Amanda, there's Julie, Tina, all sorts, a dozen or more.
I wonder if Eddie Stobart likes drinking cider, because he names all his lorries after ladies.
Does he?
So maybe that's where he got the idea from.
Yes, I don't know whether I did acquire, when we set up this new orchard 7-8 years ago, I did acquire about a dozen of these new apples. They haven't performed that well, actually, for me. Maybe it's my site.
Yeah.
Although some of the grafts I've taken, because the first thing I do when I get an apple I've bought is to copy it, because I've spent real money and I don't want to spend it again if it dies. And maybe I need two of everything at least. Yep. Actually, some of the girls are looking better on my grafts after 3 or 4 years. I'm getting some quite nice apples. So I haven't been able to assess them yet to put my stamp of approval on whether I'm going to include them significantly in my mixes. That's one of the things for the future, one of the exciting things.
So we're talking there about very sweet apples and sort of sickly apples and thick apples, or the different varieties of apples that you can get that make the different juices. Are there any apples that you wouldn't put in a cider? Yes.
Well, obviously, really, really sharp ones, you'd only put a little bit in at the most.
Right.
You certainly wouldn't put more than 10% in if that. On, say, Bramleys, unless they're really, really ripe, only a little bit of Bramley.
So cooking apples, probably not.
Cooking apples, not too much. But, some cooking apples can actually make quite a nice light cider. It's deceptive. It's not really... It's called a sharp and acid apple, but you get different strengths. So don't rule them all out. Try them. But something that's really strong, you want to limit the amount. Some things just have a very unpleasant flavour. I've worked through a lot, and one that comes to mind, Norfolk Beefing, which is really I'm not sure quite what you do with it other than squash it in an oven and serve it as a beefing, as a biffing. I did try that because I had a lot, and never again. I didn't put it in to ruin a mix, but I could tell from the flavour it got poured straight down the drain. There were lots of other apples that don't contribute very much. Fillers, I call them, if you're a bit short, then if you've got some good flavour from other ones that help you out a bit on the juice. Early apples generally don't make good cider, so don't think you'd have a lot of success with that all those beauty of baths that fall on the ground in August. You could try it, but I wouldn't be too hopeful for anything enjoyable. August, a lot of things like Morgan Sweets that are sold doesn't make a terribly exciting cider. It's perhaps you could use those for juice with a bit of acid stuff. Keep those for apple juice, I think, when you need some in August. Yeah, so it really comes back mainly to mixes of flavour. What you want is good flavour. So apples that you really enjoy eating when they're fully ripe are probably going to be good for the cider.
Okay, brilliant. So I think what we've learnt, Mike, is that a good balance of apples is going to make a nice cider. What about alcohol levels? My understanding is cider's generally sort of anywhere between 6 and 10%. Yeah,
10% is a bit on the high side. I think legally it's got to be less than 8.4 or something, somewhere around there.
Right.
Otherwise it would be classed as a wine.
Yeah.
It would be a different duty level. Not that affects the home cider maker too much, but...
Because if you're making cider for your own consumption, you don't need to register with anyone, or you can pretty much...
No, if you're not going to sell and you're just making a little bit, I wouldn't worry about it. If you're going to thinking of selling, you do need to register.
Yep.
You can find that on a government webpage.
That's with customs and excise.
With customs and excise, yes. You register as a small cider maker.
Yeah.
It's a remarkably unbureaucratic process.
Okay.
You just fill in the form and send it back, and you're a small cider maker.
Okay.
A little bit later, you'll get a phone call from a custom and excise officer who'll might want to come round just to have a little chat to make sure you do understand the limits and things. So you're allowed to make, I believe, 7,000 litres a year. That's total. That's not 7,000 to sell. That's 7,000 total.
Yep.
So if you drink 6,000 litres a year, you can only sell 1,000 without paying duty. Otherwise, duty, I think, last time I looked, was 32 pence a litre.
Yep.
And if you go over your 7,000 litres, you've got to pay it on the whole lot. So if you want to jump from a small cider maker to a bigger one, you've got a bit of a hump to get over.
It's a big step.
Big step, isn't it? Yeah, you've got to know that you're going to sell enough to pay all that duty.
Yeah, and you also need to register with food hygiene.
Yes, if you're going to sell, you do need to contact your local VHOs, and they'll want to produce a process, a procedure. They'll want you to explain or in detail what you do and highlight all the potential hazards and what steps you're taking to avoid those hazards. Advise you if your efforts are not good enough.
That's it. And just thinking about the alcohol content, so it can, the stronger ciders do definitely taste slightly different, don't they? If you want to get a really full flavoured.
Yeah, you'll get, generally, if you're using the higher sugar cider apples, you could get 8%, maybe even a little higher with some. Some might claim 9%.
Yep.
To me, I did actually initially plant some of those trees because I thought...
What varieties are you thinking of planting?
Things like Golden Harvey is one that I had identified as giving high alcohol.
Okay. And was it nice?
What's it like?
Was it a good cider?
I've never actually got enough apples off it to make a gallon yet.
Right,
I've had it about 10 years, and
the
original trees sulked, and I've sort of taken signs and put them in the field, and I have got a few apples on it. So that's one of the things to find out.
Okay.
But we have had quite high alcohol ones from others, and I've moved away now from the desire to have high alcohol. I can already make ones that I can taste the alcohol. The alcohol is becoming dominant.
Right.
And to me, that's not what I want. Other people, I'm sure, alcohol is everything. Then they're the ones that should seek out these particular trees.
Yep.
And to make their strong stuff. But alcohol is quite a strong flavour, and to me, it unbalances it.
Yep.
And so I've lost interest, really. If this tree ever gives me 10 kilos, I shall make one just for interest. I doubt that I should drink it.
You might have to use a champagne yeast or something like that to give it an extra boost to get it.
It may be that it's difficult to get it to ferment out with a cider yeast. Indeed, yeah.
Okay, but so from your point of view, you think a decent cider should be what, about 6%?
Yeah, 6%. That's
a good level.
That's right. Yeah, if you want a long drink, you want less cider, less alcohol in the cider, don't you? Really?
Yep, definitely.
So you can drink more.
Okay, thank you very much. So you, again, thinking a little bit more about cider making. If you've not done it before, is there anywhere you could sort of send our listeners to go and research a little bit more?
Well, of course, there's a lot on the web these days. I'd recommend a couple of books.
Okay.
One is the guy who ran the course that we went on. It was called Mike Pooley. He wrote a book with John Lomax called Real Cider Making. That's very much a community-biased book, right? How to use it as part of building a community. Yeah. It has some good technical stuff in as well. But for the real technical stuff, not over the top, but where you want real detail, Andrew Lee wrote Craft Cider Making. Now, you'll find a lot of his stuff has been published online, but comes together nicely in his book. And he was, in fact, worked at Long Ashton Research that we talked about earlier for many years until it disappeared. And I think his mission came to make sure that information wasn't lost, and which is why he's put a lot of it online. So those are good sources.
Brilliant.
If you want to actually go to somewhere to learn to cider make, there are courses all over the place now.
Yeah.
There's a Milton Keynes cider maker you'd find for around here. The local fruit group, the orchard group, the Midshires Orchard Group. For several years, we've run a cider course for them. Unfortunately, that's stopped while COVID's been on. We hope we might restart.
Okay. So we can Google MSOG.
Yeah, Google MSOG for Midshires Orchard Group.
And that's Milton Keynes based, isn't it?
And there are lots of other benefits from them. They in fact will be, they get involved with the Buckingham Garden Centre with their Apple Day.
Yep.
And have over the last few years helped organise several Apple Days in the area. They run a Cyan Day where you can swap sticks of apple varieties and go and grow your own. That's a whole subject in itself. They have a home orchard in Milton Keynes, which has actually got 7 different varieties of true cider apples. They run work parties there. People who go along and do a little bit of work become eligible to help themselves to the cider apples.
Okay.
So if you're thinking maybe of making cider, you've got quite a few of your own cookers and eaters, but feel you, from what you've heard today, you might think you'd like to throw a few cider apples in to balance it up, then that's a excellent source of these perhaps less available apples.
And that's over in Milton Keynes.
That's over in the middle of
original Milton Keynes, am I allowed to call it? The old part.
Yeah. And other benefits, if you want to know how to prune in the winter, you go along and they'll teach you how to prune, and you can be let loose on a tree yourself. And both, they have some newer ones and older ones, so you can try different styles of pruning. So, can't recommend too much Midshires Orchard Group. There are other groups as well.
Is there a national source of information that we can look for on Google?
Well, certainly organisations like the East of England's Apple and Orchards project. They're very good. They do good trainings on pruning. To find out where there are anything to do with apple events and orchards and cider courses in particular, do go look at the Orchard Network site. Okay. They always have a pretty thorough listing throughout the country.
That'd be good across because then people who aren't local to us will.
To the west of us, the Gloucester Orchard Trust, I had a lot of benefit from them. They've been very active, good training courses, look at their webpage, and you'll find lots of references to different things. Good hunting area there.
Brilliant.
RHS, if you're an RHS member, then you can, for very little money, join the fruit group. Do some good visits. Okay. They have a local, a Midlands group which goes and visits places, and there's lots of once you get into it, there's lots of places and organisations that can help you.
Brilliant. Okay, Mike. Well, I think that probably just about wraps it up for cider making today. Thank you very much for all of your tips and ideas on how we can improve our cider making, and thank you.
Thank you.
So I've been brewing various different beers and ciders over the years, and I must say, I've never had that much success with cider. It's always it's just about drinkable, but Mike has clearly done a lot more work on experimenting what the flavours are that make a decent cider. And as you have hopefully learned a few of his tips, it really is something that it's not just as simple as taking some apple juice, putting a bit of yeast into it and wait a couple of months and hey, presto, you've got wonderful tasting cider. It really is a bit of an art, and there's obviously different types of ciders, from dry ciders, sweet ciders, and learning how to make all those different types is, I'm sure, for some people a lifetime's work. So I hope what we've learned today has helped inspire you to possibly having a go at making some cider, or possibly having another go at making cider if you've done it before and it didn't turn out quite right. It's certainly good fun, and I think that's part of the joy of cider making, is you can make it a social affair and get together with your neighbours who've also got some apples and crush them all up and turn them into juice and then see what you can make. So in next week's show, we've got Mike back again to talk us through growing the fruit and growing apples and how to get the best out of your apple trees and what he does to create orchards. I mean, he's put a lot of energy into his different projects and has created, I think it's 11 acres of community orchard now for his local community, and it's a real good, nice area to go and walk around. I know certainly Woughton apple orchard that he took me to once, I was really blown away. I mean, it's I think it was planted before Milton Keynes sort of was really became Milton Keynes, and it's just a nice big orchard. It's a very peaceful place to go and explore, and same as anything anywhere with lots of different varieties of fruit, it's really interesting to be able to walk around and pick up the odd apple off the ground and taste it and think, oh, wow, that's sour, or wow, that's lovely. I know I've certainly enjoyed doing that. And if you're interested in finding out sort of where you can go locally, have a look on orchardproject.org or ptes.org. If you Google those, you'll find some more information about orchards in your area. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's show and look forward to having you along again soon.
Today's show was brought to you by Buckingham Garden Centre and Nurseries. The show was hosted by Peter Brown. The show was produced by Peter Brown. And our thanks to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music. Thanks for listening.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. From parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.